before leaving the topic of lighting as it relates to Bryce Landscaping, I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the HDRI aspect. In the last tutorial we spent a lot of time setting up fog and haze, and then sort of as a last minute got round to throwing a HDRI into the scene. So in this video we're just going to focus on that. Now this scene's been set up and you can see we've got these tall islands. It's actually on a lattice, and the lighting in this is predominantly from the Bryce sun, which is tinted yellow, and we've got general lighting arriving from the HDRI. But to improve render performance, what I've done, if we go into the Skylab, image-based lighting tab, is I've turned the shadows off. Now, turning the shadows off will have, to some extent, a detrimental effect on the appearance of the materials. But it depends how strong the lighting is that's arriving from your sky as to whether this is going to be significant or not. If I turn the shadows on, you'll be able to see one of the problems that we have when you render this scene. So now with shadow casting on, because of the arrangement of these tall islands, there are some areas like here, though they appear lit because of haze and fog effects, in actual fact there is no information there as far as the material. And if I was just temporarily, so I hold the Alt key down, click on fog and haze icons there, those little thumbnails, you can see now that these areas are fully black. Now this brings me back to the image-based lighting tab here, where we can turn the cast shadows on and off. Not only that, we have an intensity control. Now if you remember back to the last video, I said in the sun and moon you want the intensity of the global shadow casting turned to 100. This intensity control you will tend to want to have set at 100 unless you get in a position where you've got objects in your scene that can be seen by the camera, but these objects have no view of any light sources in the sky. To get over this, you can turn the quality up. That will create more simulated light sources in your HDRI. I'll just speak briefly about this HDRI. This is one created by Horo, and it's been specifically designed to have some light from the ground and light from the sky, but without any predominant light source. So this is ideal for incorporating the Bryce sun with the HDRI image. Now I've done this a lot in the past with HDRI images, but they've also tended to have suns in of their own. So I would end up lining the sun up with the sun in the HDRI image to control the light levels, or I might find the sun was such a dominant light source that it got very little ambient light. So to overcome that issue, this has been specially created by Horo, so we've just got the ambient light from the sky. Otherwise, if you've got sunlight in your HDRI, then you can try doing things like getting a Bryce primitive and positioning it over the sun where it's providing predominant light source. So you've cut that out. That's one approach. You can modify the HDRI in another package like HDR Shot, for example. I'm not really very familiar with that, so I don't want to go on too long about that. No, you can generate HDRIs from the Bryce sky. That's covered in other tutorials where you can actually switch the sun off in the sky, so you're just capturing the ambient of the environment. But right, so anyway, we've still got this problem with the shadows irrespective of how we've not got the sun problem. So this intensity control could be employed here to let some light through, or we can turn up the quality, because if we turn up the quality we get more light sources. So let's try quality first, because that's going to be the best option, although at its default setting it's going to increase the render time significantly. So with our render now, and let's see whether we manage to hit any more. Well, it's taken us up to 7 minutes and this area is still appearing dark, so that's not really solved our problem, and it's going to take a lot longer to render. So stick that back down there, and what we'll do is set this at 50. Now that should allow some light through there, so we'll see a bit of the material. It's still rather dark, but by the same token it's not going to have the tremendous effect on the render time. So, and if we'll turn it down a bit further, so the intensity of the shadows is very weak now, but we're still getting some shadow effect, and now you can definitely see there's a bit of light in there. And when that's recombined with haze and fog, then you can definitely see a bit that the rock is lit. Although at 20 this is not very intense, so at this point you have to consider whether it's worth having the shadows at all. So what we're saying, 43 seconds on the second pass, then it goes down to 37. We'll just turn the shadows off and see if it's significantly faster. 27.8. So you can see it was worth turning the shadows off completely, because the effect of having the shadows there either was detrimental and we couldn't see the material on this side. If we had a bit of shadow, so we still had some shadowing effect, then it was increasing the render time significantly, so turn the shadows off. What we'll do now is we'll load in another HDRI from set. So I'll open this one, and I'm going to bring in, that was Lake Roof, let's have Wastelands 3. Okay. Remembering when you load in a HDRI, sun's automatically disabled, and in the atmosphere, fog and haze are also disabled. But this is handy because we can now consider what light is arriving just from the HDRI. So we'll turn the light up. There's rather a lot of light there, and it's not very deeply coloured blue because the light's arriving mostly from these clouds. So I'll turn the colour saturation up, try and make it a bit bluer. It didn't really work very well. I'm going to give it intensity of 100. Now, at this point, because there's an even distribution of light arriving from the backdrop, and you can see how flat things look. So this is a bit of a problem now, because we're wanting to use this HDRI because I can take advantage of the nice patterns in the sky, for example, whereas the other one was rather plain. But we're going to have problems setting the lighting up here. So this is a challenge to be overcome. So I'm going to turn the lighting down a bit, and I'll just show you here that the water plane's always excluded. That's just been set from the beginning. So even if we turn cast shadows up, any light arriving from the underside, which you can see if I increase the intensity, will still be affecting the material. Right, let's try it at 100 intensity on the shadows and see what's not getting lit. So quite a lot of things are not getting lit, which is a problem because we want them to be lit. I don't know whether this sky is going to help us more if we turn the number of light sources up or not, because light sources will tend to cluster because of the algorithm it's used to generate where they're placed in the sky towards the lighter areas. So you can see these areas are still dark and shadowed. So we're probably not going to get away with using cast shadows because I've created something that's difficult to light here quite deliberately. So I'll turn the shadows off, and we'll turn this effect down so it's just a fairly low level lighting. I need to get it down sufficiently low that it doesn't matter that it's not casting shadows, and then I'll turn my sun on and we'll have a look at the effect. So you can see this material is still a bit lit up, and that's when we've got the haze and the fog in, that's going to interfere with it, so probably need to reduce this still further. So it's just a bit of effect. So we've got a bit of effect there. We've got our patterns. I'm only using the low resolution versions of the HDRI. There are higher resolutions versions provided, but for keeping the memory footprint of the file down while I'm developing, because you've got to pretend that I'm continually saving this file as I'm making changes that are significant, just in case there's some kind of problem that crops up. I'm not, obviously, because I'm recording a video, but just pretend that I am. Right, I've just turned haze and fog back on to show you that adding them in has lightened the effect on this material and sort of restored us to a situation where it's looking quite good, even though we've not got the shadow casting from the HDRI, and as a result this keeps the render time down. If you've watched the videos about basic composition and got as far as the one that covers the effect, I think 4B is probably the best one, the effect of lighting, then you'll know that we won't be considering soft shadows. So this is going to be a fairly efficient render no matter what we do, so long as we stick with this present format. So the only consideration really is how we handle how much lighting and whether we're going to consider casting shadows from the HDRI image. Well, as I think I've demonstrated, casting shadows from the HDRI image isn't going to help us. The only other way we could get around this is if we were to introduce yet another light source. So I could turn the shadows on, and the problems as outlined reappears. This area gets no light, but it is having the HDRI will be helping the material appearance in the foreground, because as each bit of this material will be receiving more light from different angles, so the bump mapping will be improved by that. Well, how significant that is depends on how much lighting you've got, but as stated, there's this area here we've got no light in. So if we increase the amount of light coming from the HDRI, and although in the first video I did say you don't want to be using this control, we have the sky dome light here, and if used carefully you can use it to overcome these little problems. So let's say we wanted a bit more light on this foreground area, we wanted shadow casting, and we also wanted to overcome this problem because we've got these clusters of objects that are preventing light arriving from the outside. So low levels of sky dome, like we're just making this blue colour like this, could be added in, and they would just provide a bit of extra information in these shadow areas like so, and that will provide the impression there's something going on there, and then we'll still have the advantage of the additional lighting arriving in the foreground areas like so. Okay, what else will I want to consider? Thing is that this light is not really very strongly coloured, and I had quite a strongly coloured sun, so I'm going to go back to whatever my original one was, and I can't remember now, so it might have been this one. That's really blue. It might have been that one. Yeah, that's probably better. Don't forget we've always got the option tone mapping it if you want to reduce the intensity of the colours. So I've brought one of these back in. I'll re-enable the sun, so I've got quite blue light arriving, so I'll reduce the saturation again. I'll try 50% of that saturation. Now it's a little bit too weak, 65. I wanted a bit of blue light because I've got quite a strong sun colour, and I also want to bring in the fog and the haze, and I'm still going to have to have this sky dome light if I'm going to keep 100% shadow intensity. Probably that blue's quite strong. Don't forget you can have whatever colour you want for this sky dome colour, it's just that if it gets too bright its effect becomes too obvious. If you want to see what its effect is, choose something that isn't in the scene, and then you can see where this light is getting added in and give you some idea of what kind of intensity you want to use for it. So I've gone back to a blue colour. Let's just pick a blue colour out of the scene. I consider that this is probably a bit too saturated, so I'll move the saturation down again. I'll try 60. Usually the preview there is quite a good guide as to how you see scenes looking overall. And I've got my haze and the fog, and then I've got shadow casting, which should mean improved bump response. If I got something closer to the camera than these things and I wanted more sophisticated lighting on it, then I could use that approach. So let's just see. The only other thing is that there's still, because this is quite a craggy lattice, there's still areas where the light's not really getting into the gaps. So I might have to resort to, well, we'll try this again, turning the number of simulated lights off, so that might help. See if it does. Those cracks are quite deep. Yeah, see, there's a problem. So, is there anything else I can do? Well, as again, in the first video we talked about the ambient colour. And ambient colour can be used to fill in the gaps. So, again, this is getting onto more complex tricks. We'll just nip into the material here, and you'll see that it's only got diffuse. It's very simply though, if I hold the control key down and click on C, I can copy what we've got in blobs wise from diffuse to ambient. Then I can give it full ambient, and this will make the terrains glow whatever colour we set the ambient. So if I set the ambient to red, we've got some red glow in there, which is obviously rather excessive. So if I was to employ the same colour as I was using for the sky dome colour, I can add in light into these gaps, but you see everything's become a bit glowy in a bad way, so probably that's a bit too strong. So Alt on the colour swatch, HLS, I'll reduce its lighting by about half, copy that for the sky dome colour, go into the Skylab, reduce the intensity of my HDRI effect, because I'm just building up too many layers of light at the moment, so I'm just going to restore things down to a more sensible level. I'll keep my intense sunlight, and this has overcome to some extent the issues of not getting any light here because of casting shadows, the issues of not getting any light into these deep crevices on the surface of this lattice, and was still managing to retain some shadow effects so that the bump mapping works well. Even still, that's still looking a bit glowy. So what I shall do is I shall reduce the effect of fog and haze somewhat. So if I reduce this, it's quite tricky to do this in a way that doesn't take too much out, since I can't just cut it by 50% in this case. So I just have to take it down a bit and see what effect it has. Sometimes it's better just to remove one of the effects and deal with them in isolation. There we go. I'll switch the fog in here. The fog effect, just reduce the thickness so it's not as strong. So that you can see the contrast increasing now on the foreground objects, and adding ambient light and sky dome has the effect of reducing contrast. So we're offsetting it by reducing the fog and haze settings, which themselves reduce contrast. So restoring it to a more contrasty image, if you like. So let's see. This now is going to take a little bit longer to render, than the original image, which I'll just remind you looked like that. And you can see this is quite high contrast, and the reason for that was I wanted to keep the fill-in lighting down in these areas because it wasn't casting shadows properly. It was just arriving on the surfaces and passing straight through them because shadow casting was turned off. So to get better lighting, better simulation, what we've done is turn the shadows back on, and then it's going to, as you can see, have more light. Now, if it turns out that we're seeing some shadow bands from the simulated light source in the sky, even though it didn't solve our problem with the very craggy surface, it might be necessary to introduce more light sources. But bear in mind, this is going to slow things down, and even still, this is still looking a bit too brightly lit to me, so I'm going to reduce the intensity of that still further. So we've got the intense sunlight and then just the shadow regions filled in, and now I've increased the render time to, well, it's showing about 1:30 now, whereas before it was indeed seconds. So we'll just see how that renders out, make a final comparison with the two renders. So I'll just pause the video here. Here then is the final render after its anti-aliasing pass. It's taken significantly longer than the original one, which looked like this and only took a few seconds to render, whereas this one took minutes. But you can see this has got more advanced lighting in that we've got multiple light sources that are casting shadows, so those will work better with materials. And if we had anything much closer to the camera, then very basic lighting like this would become quite obvious. So very much depends upon your subject, which lighting you want to employ, and then the consideration of how long it finally takes to render. But in either case, seconds or minutes is not too bad. If you start getting onto hours, then you really got to give some serious consideration to this. But in this tutorial, what we've done is we've focused upon really what use we've got from these controls here, which are sky dome color and ambient color and the shadow intensity control, even though we ended up with 100% intensity in the end, how you can use them subtly to add to your lighting system when you've got lighting problems. Ideally, you want to avoid all three of these. You want 100% shadows, you want no sky dome colour, you don't really want to be using ambient to make materials glow. In this case we made the terrain material, well, the lattice material glow. But if you're stuck, and the alternative beyond this is to use things like obscure lighting, transience lighting, which are very long render times by comparison. So you might be talking about hours to render to get a similar effect. Then it's worth knowing about these little workarounds you can employ, and haze and fog settings, just to offset things so you can have your renders done in minutes rather than hours. So there you go, that's the end of the tutorial. I hope you found that interesting and that you'll be able to use these methods in your own renders.